Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAMH for short.
Good evening. You're very welcome, everyone, to this seminar of the ACES Special Interest Group. And I hope you will have seen from the text that the theme for this evening's seminar, bullying and victimization, is going to be addressed by our speaker this evening, Nora Trompeter, and also Lucy Bowes. So I think that that ACAMH is providing a tremendous amount of information on this very important theme. And it's interesting that last week we had the presentation from the group about the issue of verbal abuse, and heard from Shanta Doob, colleagues, about the very interesting thinking going on about this. And really it's part of the whole process of understanding the extensiveness of adversity that children and young people are exposed to, and their impact. I'm pleased to say that the newsletter from our special interest group will be landing in your inboxes very shortly. And there's a tremendous range of very interesting research going on at the moment, looking at the impact on neurological functioning, understanding what are the factors which mean that some individuals have long-term impacts and others not, the whole issue of the subjective appraisal of experiences. There's so much that we're beginning to understand about adversity. And this evening, our speaker, Nora Trompeter, she's a research fellow at University College in the Population Policy and Practice Department, and it's been our great privilege to hear from members of that department who are contributing so much to our knowledge and understanding. She completed her PhD in psychology at Macquarie University, and she lived in Sydney, that's extraordinary city, now living here, not extraordinary in a different way, but she was interested in the theme of the link between emotional dysregulation and adolescent eating disorder symptoms. So she's concerned with the social and emotional risk factors for adolescent mental health problems, particularly eating disorder and anxiety. But the presentation this evening is going to look at the intriguing and interesting and important relationship between bullying victimization and adverse childhood experiences. And we know that both are linked with mental health problems in adolescence, but little has been known about the overlap between the two factors, how this impacts adolescent mental health problems. And Nora's going to present data from a study estimating the associations between ACEs, bullying, victimization, and mental health problems, respectively, adjusting for sex, race, ethnicity, country of birth, household income, parental education, and the study site. And we'll be discussing the implications for practice. So this is a very important and a theme which has particular relevance as the nature of bullying and victimization becomes even more complex with bullying online, and the accounts of individuals who've been harassed and bullying online indicate the level of distress which can be associated. And so it's so important to have a broad picture of the background experiences of the adversity to which these young people have been exposed, so that we can really begin to have an understanding of these processes and begin to know how can we intervene and make a difference. So, Nora, perhaps you'd like to introduce your presentation now. Please, may I just add we do invite you, put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll hope to deal with as many as we can. This is a very important function. It's always an issue when it's a webinar and we can't talk to you directly, but good questions and issues that you care to raise really create a real dynamic. And I think that we should have a very interesting discussion on this important theme. So thank you very much, Nora.
No, thank you so much, Anand. Hopefully you can all see my slides. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here today, and for that kind introduction. So, and all of those joining online. So, as we said, today I really want to share with you some research looking at bullying and adverse childhood experiences, especially thinking about how these two concepts relate to one another. What are their similarities? What are the differences? And how do they co-occur, or what might be happening if we see these exposures combined in childhood? And what that might mean for both practice and research as well. So as Anand said, there will be time for questions. So if you do have any thing you would like to know more about, or are curious about, or even just want to share your thoughts, I do very much encourage you to put those in the Q&A box. But to get us started with, and really thinking about why this is important to think about in the context of youth mental health, I think it's really important to acknowledge that unfortunately, both bullying experiences and adverse childhood experiences are relatively common. So we don't have great prevalence data on either of these phenomena, actually. But we can estimate that about 40% of young people in the UK do report some level of bullying. And if we're looking at ACEs, it's estimated that in the UK, about half of adults have experienced at least one type of adverse childhood experience. So again, there's a lot of variability within those experiences and within those numbers, but just acknowledging that both phenomena are relatively common and do impact people significantly. All right, so what do we mean when we use these terms? So first, thinking about bullying, we might all have an idea of what bullying looks like, or we have a definition in our heads of what it is. But if we're thinking definitionally, we really define bullying as a repetitive, intentional act where one person or a group is hurting another person. And it often also involves an imbalance of power, whereby the bully has some kind of power over the victim, whether that is real or perceived. It can also happen in a range of contexts, and there has been a lot of change if you think about recent decades on how bullying is experienced. So it can be physical, verbal, psychological. It can happen face to face, or now more commonly, more as well in the online sphere. So lots of different types of bullying and how this might be experienced, but I do just want to distinguish between two types of broad types of bullying that I think really help contextualize this issue, and types that are really relevant for practice. Yeah. So when we think about bullying, I think most people really think about a traditional type of bullying, which is often also called direct bullying. So this is your face-to-face bullying that can either be physical, so pushing someone, hitting, kicking, shoving someone, or something like that, or verbal bullying, so name calling, belittling someone, teasing, although I must add, teasing here is really from a hurtful sense, not in a friendly way. So these are really what we think about as direct bullying, where there's a face-to-face act and a bully perpetrates against the victim. Another type of bullying that is, I think, important to distinguish is more indirect forms of bullying. So this includes relational bullying, so excluding others on purpose, spreading rumors, ridiculing someone behind their back. And this often also is where the, I guess, newer forms of bullying fall into with online bullying. So posting something deliberately hurtful on social media, social exclusion, but also sending direct messages to someone with that, again, are belittling or ridiculing. So that's kind of what we think about when we have bullying, and we do have these two types of it, but they often co-occur and do have similar outcomes. Then turning, I guess, more to the other side of this talk, when we're thinking about adverse childhood experiences. In terms of definitions, this one's a little bit trickier, but really thinking about highly stressful and potentially traumatic events or situations that occur during childhood or adolescence. So we're really thinking kind of anywhere in that childhood period, something that happens that has the potential to have long-lasting effects on adolescents. That sounds very vague and could include a lot of things, which is, I guess, one of the themes to this talk. But I guess traditionally, these are there are 10, I guess, original ACEs. So these are based on a study by Felitti in the US in the late 1990s, really kind of set the scene for looking at ACEs. And they broadly include areas that focus on child maltreatment, so child abuse, but also child neglect. And then broader themes around relating to household dysfunction. So, for example, parental mental health problems or parental separation. So these are the kind of the core 10 original ACEs. And there's been a lot of study and research based on these, I guess, original ACEs that spurred that. It's also been included in many of the kind of screening programs for ACEs that include these kind of 10 factors. And it begs the question, kind of, if we go back to this really broad definition of what an ACE is, as like whether these 10 ACEs are actually encompassing all what we mean in terms of adversity. And there have been many criticisms to this list to say it's there are very important factors that are not included. Also, so we think, yeah, like this was in the last 20 years, there may be other things that have happened that we now think of adversities that may have been less current 20 years ago. So yeah, just want to acknowledge that there's these are the original 10. There are a lot of there's a lot of debate about what should and shouldn't be on this type of list, I guess. And one of the things that often comes up as well are peer factors. So these don't include anything relating to peer experiences, such as bullying. And I guess that's kind of where I want to focus on a little bit more if we're thinking about what is bullying and how does that fit with our idea of an adverse childhood experience. If we go back to But we think an adverse childhood experience it's a highly stressful and traumatic event. We could argue that bullying is a highly stressful, potentially traumatic event that occurs during childhood or adolescence. And so this idea is new. I'm not the first person to raise this, and it has sometimes been included in when we're thinking about adversity, and other times not. So let's think about this concept a little bit more. All right, so leading to the question whether bullying victimization should be considered an ACE. Is it the same? Can we put it under this umbrella? Is it different? Is it its own problem that shouldn't be merged with these other experiences? So that's where I want to dig in a little bit further now. So firstly, thinking about the similarities, I already talked definitional wise. If we're looking at definitions, we can definitely see some kind of overlap between the two things. We can see that they are both occur during childhood or adolescence. They're stressful, potentially traumatic. But there are some other important things as well to consider. Firstly, there's a high co-occurrence between bullying and ACEs. So if, they're also both linked with poor mental health outcomes, and they also tend to be more common amongst disadvantaged youth. So let's look at these a little bit further. All right, so first thinking about the co-occurrence of bullying and ACEs. So victims of bullying are more likely to report a history of ACEs compared to non-victims. And that is true for both face-to-face bullying and online forms of bullying. So there's something going on that puts people, more likely adolescents or children, who have experienced other forms of adversity to also experience bullying. And there's a bit of an idea of this, or a theory called the cycle of victimization that often kind of says if someone starts experiencing one form of victimization, they will also be more vulnerable to experience other types of victimization in the future. And this seems to hold for the ACEs and bullying relationship, whereby having experienced childhood adversity makes someone more likely to then also become the victim of bullying more often later in life in adolescence. So there's something going on between these two concepts that place children at heightened risk. They're also both linked with poor mental health outcomes. So, and the areas where they do overlap the most is that both bullying and ACEs are linked to heightened anxiety and depression. They're both linked to lower school attendance and also higher levels of substance use. So, some of these outcomes are experienced by people who experience, if we're looking at only people who experience bullying, and then you look at people who experience ACEs, we're kind of seeing similar patterns in what happens to them both concurrently and later in life. So we can kind of see already a pattern of, well, they're more likely to go together than not. They have similar outcomes to one another. And then last thing I just want to briefly touch on in terms of prevalence as well, both ACEs and bullying are more common in areas of disadvantage. They're more common among low SES households and both linked with lower education. So they also share some common risk factors or areas where they're more commonly experienced. So if you're looking at all these similarities, thinking, well, if they all go together, if they have similar outcomes and they happen to similar people, shouldn't they maybe be considered part of the same group or concept? So I just want to, now that we've talked about similarities, thinking about some of the differences. And I think the two key differences that are really important to think about in this context are the context in which they occur and the timing at which they occur. So thinking about this a bit further, when we're thinking about ACEs, and especially the traditional original ACEs, these mostly happen in a family context. They're related to child abuse and neglect, which are experienced within the family context, but also family and household dysfunction, again, something that's experienced at home in the family context. Whereas bullying is quite different from that, in that it's experienced in a peer context. If we're thinking about face-to-face bullying, it's almost always experienced in the outside of the home, so commonly at school or at kind of recreational activities. And even if we're thinking about cyberbullying, which could happen anywhere, it still has that peer context. It's experienced in a situation where young people are engaging with their peers, or the other person who they're engaged with is a peer. So quite different contexts for how these are experienced. The other thing to think about is timing. So ACEs are commonly experienced during early childhood, or they persist throughout childhood. So these are issues that are often happen during early childhood and then persist, or are reoccurring themes through someone's childhood and become kind of that part of that person's childhood. Whereas bullying victimization is a bit different from that, in that it usually occurs during late childhood and early adolescence. So it's kind of a peak period. As children enter school, bullying becomes more common. It kind of peaks around that early adolescent stage, and then bullying rates decline as they get older. But really important here, it tends to happen at a very different developmental stage compared to ACEs. And if we're thinking about that, how that relates to the context as well, in our early development, we spend most of our time with in our family contexts. We're growing up, we're mostly with our parents, and then we slowly start engaging with peers. And by the time it kind of comes around to school age and we're going into adolescence, people spend increasingly time with their peers, and that's also when bullying is most prevalent. So, great question. Where does that leave us? So we have two concepts that are somewhat related, but they are also somewhat different. So this is where I now want to talk a little bit about some of the research we've done to look at the relationship between bullying and ACEs, to try and, I guess, untangle some of these questions a little bit more. And we really thought about this from two different ways they could both relate to another. So what type of associations might one find? So we could think about them as cumulative, where both bullying and ACEs independently contribute to poorer outcomes. And this, there is quite a lot of work just generally on the cumulative effects of adversity, that the more someone experiences, the worse their outcomes will be. And it's also one of the key frameworks that underpins, I guess, the work that came out of the original ACEs, where someone is given a total score of ACEs to kind of say, this is how much adversity has someone experienced, but it doesn't give any information of what that experience was, but simply a cumulative score. So, and the idea here was if bullying is experienced as more cumulative in the context of ACEs, it might fall more within the umbrella of ACEs. If it's cumulative, then it kind of behaves like some of the other ACEs that we can think about it. Whereas another way they could relate to one another is more interactive. So thinking, okay, if someone has a history of childhood experience, adverse childhood experiences, if they then also experience bullying, maybe that will worsen their outcomes. So having this history makes the effects worse compared to. So it's not just additive, but rather it interacts with one another. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit now. All right. There we go. All right, so as I said, I do want to talk about this one study we did in particular. So we used data from the ABCD study in the US. It's a large study being conducted where adolescents are followed. They're currently being followed up yearly or so in a pattern. And they've got a large range of data. So for our study in particular, we used information from over 8,000 early adolescents, so they were aged around 12 years old. And the nice thing about this particular cohort is as well, they did place great emphasis on ethnic diversity in the sample. So we do have and again, this is a US context, but we do have some variability in there, which isn't always the case for research in this area. And they completed, so at age 12, they completed some self-report measures on bullying. So they were asked about their experiences in a peer context, both relating to face-to-face bullying and also online forms of bullying. And then their parents reported on children's mental health and also children's experience of ACEs. So I think that's just something important to keep in mind about who reported on what. So the children reported on their bullying experience and the parents reported on their children's mental health and their children's experience with ACEs. All right, so a bit more information about the kind of group we're looking at here. So when we're looking at the number of ACEs experienced, so we split this into no ACEs, that was around 20% of the sample, one ACE, around 36%, two, 28%, and then we got into the higher numbers of 3 ACEs, 13%, and 4%, 4 or more. So keeping in mind at this time they were 12 years old as well. So it was still during childhood. In terms of bullying, so lots of children reported having experienced some type of bullying. So this was any occurrence of bullying, around 70%. Most of this was what we would say are the indirect forms of bullying, so relational, reputational, or cyberbullying, the more of the direct forms of bullying, a little bit less prevalent, but also not as much cyberbullying. Again, if we're thinking about these 12-year-olds, so it might be a bit different for other age groups. But yeah, just to give you kind of a picture of the kind of children we're looking at here and what their histories were like. So yes, so as I said, we wanted to look at how bullying and ACEs kind of go together when we're looking at mental health symptoms. And there we really see that we really saw these cumulative effects. So both having experienced ACEs and having experienced bullying victimization were associated with more internalizing and more externalizing problems, and they're both independently. So even when accounting for the effects of one another, we still saw an increase in the symptoms, and this was really following, yeah, this might show it a little bit nicer, really showing a kind of cumulative pattern. So no interaction between them. It's not that having had the ACEs then made the effects of the bullying stronger or weaker. They really parallel if we look at them, but we can see here also the dose-dependent relationship between ACEs and mental health outcomes. So the more they experience, the poorer mental health outcomes they reported. And same thing for, you can see in the bottom line, we have kids that weren't bullied, and then top we can see the kids that were. So they also reported higher problems, and it was just kind of, yeah, more was worse. But having experienced just one or both of them, it didn't change the relationship between these outcomes. Excellent. So from the data we are looking at right here, if we're thinking about these two different types of associations that we could have between bullying and ACEs, it's really the cumulative model that was supported with this data, whereby both bullying and ACEs contributed independently to poor outcomes, but didn't really interact with one another. So that was just a very quick run through the results. If someone does want more information, do put it in the Q&A. Happy to chat about it later. But want to think a little bit about what we can learn from this and what this means more broadly. If we're thinking about having thought about kind of similarities and differences of ACEs and bullying, we now know that there might follow more of a cumulative relationship between one another. So where does that leave us essentially? And I think also taking the context today, I wanted to touch a little bit on implications for practice. I think it really lends itself to really to thinking about including bullying in any screenings for ACEs or adversities, especially if we're thinking about adolescents, so people who are at that stage where they might be more likely to also experience bullying, because we can see that it has, and we know this from past research as well, we know that bullying is linked to poor mental health outcomes. And this might be similar to other types of adversity they have experienced. So screening for it can help us maybe identify people who are at heightened risk to either already experience symptoms of poor mental health or go on to experience symptoms of poor mental health. Secondly, I think there's really scope to raise awareness of the overlap between bullying and ACEs. And this, I think, applies to adversity more general, if we're really thinking about that these phenomena often don't occur in isolation. If something's happening to a young person, it's likely that there are other things going on in their lives as well, or have happened in the past. So thinking about, okay, if someone is experiencing, for example, problems with bullying, do they also experience problems maybe in a family context? So they might go on to experience victimization in relationships and things like that. So really thinking about what that might mean for that person, and also keeping in mind that we don't always, and I think this is especially relevant when we're thinking about ACEs, we don't always know what has happened in a child's life or what their family context looks like. So thinking about that as well. And just broadly as well, just providing extra support for youth that are at risk for experiencing ACEs, bullying, and poor mental health, and also bullied youth. And we know these things are linked to poor mental health outcomes, so intervening early when we know they might be experiencing something, even if we don't know the whole picture for what is going on, we might at least have some idea that this person, a person is more likely to experience poor mental health, and be able to, and also to help them cope with the experiences that they had, especially in a bullying context. And I just want to go back to the question I kind of started with at the beginning, is whether bullying should be considered an ACE. I think there's a lot more debate needed around what we actually consider an ACE, what is it and isn't on the list. We see this as a big problem in research in particular. Some people include some things, other people don't. And then what are we actually measuring? But I think if we're thinking about this very broadly, then I think there's enough evidence to suggest that bullying is kind of part of that childhood adversity group. I think it's similar enough in how it presents, how it impacts young people, and it is also serious enough that it deserves this consideration. But maybe also whether we need to think about ACEs, not just one umbrella, but thinking about them in different contexts where we might think of bullying as a peer-specific ACE. And there's a lot more research coming out on this more recently, trying to, I guess, group some of the ACEs, because we're saying, even with the original ones, maybe not, they're not all the same. They're all different experiences in their own right. So maybe we can think about this with ACEs as well, whereby we might have the more traditional forms, which we could group into maltreatment and family dysfunction. And then we have a separate type of ACE for, I guess, peer problems, and maybe as adolescents get older as well, also issues in regarding relationships, might also encompass some of the issues youth are experiencing with discrimination, those kind of factors. And there is some emerging evidence that this kind of framework is really helpful and useful in understanding different types of adversity. But I think there's a lot more we need to understand about how these different types of adversities, how they go together, and how they interact with one another. What is the relationship between them, to really untangle this and understand it, and also think about it from a practical point of view. What's useful? What would help us in being able to understand the impacts of adversity on youth mental health? Yeah, there we go. So I talked a little bit about practice already, but I think there's also a lot more we need to learn about these associations in our research. And as Anand said, there's a lot happening in this field at the moment, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So I think very importantly, we really need to understand these long-term relationships between adverse childhood experiences, bullying, and mental health outcomes, and really follow the same people to kind of see how is this impacting them, what might be some of the time ordering effects, especially with a lot of the traditional ACE research. It was often thinking about, okay, we have adults, let's ask them what happened in their childhood. Did these things happen to them? And depending on what happened, what is their mental health like now? Whereas a lot more research is now shifting focus on measuring these things throughout childhood, and then seeing how is it impacting young people later, which is answering some really important questions around not is it, and overcoming some of the limitations of maybe we only remember things if they had a negative outcome on us, as opposed to if we asked people at the time. There is also a lot I think we need to disentangle in terms of the actual ACEs. So for most of what I talked about today, I really just handled everything as an umbrella term of adversity, and then looked at bullying separately. But obviously, even within that group of adversities, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and we can think some of the even the traditional ACEs, we're grouping things like parental separation and sexual abuse together and saying, okay, if you have one, you get the same score, even though we know that they have very different impacts on children's mental health outcomes. So I think there's a lot more work we need to do in understanding what types of adversity are particularly impactful when we're thinking about long-term outcomes, and how they go together without losing the big picture as well of just sometimes we need to look at adversity as a whole thing rather than getting into the nitty-gritty. So really balancing those two aspects of getting detailed information and not losing the big picture. So yes, a lot more work to be done, a lot more to be understood, but I think there's some really exciting research coming out. I'm looking forward to reading the newsletter, to seeing what's been done recently. That's all I have for now, which means there will be plenty of time for questions. You can also reach out to me later if you like, if you do have any ongoing questions. So I'll leave that up for a minute, and then I also have, I can put this up back later. If you do want to read more about the study I presented, you can read that paper there with the QR code. I've got the link there as well. Yeah, and I will leave it there.
Nora, there's really already been some really very interesting questions which has come up. And I think one of the ones fairly straightforward is, are there cultural differences? Because you described from the study the rates, and you indicated that perhaps the strength of the particular subject you're looking at is that there are good information about ethnic differences. So would you like to comment on the issue of vulnerability across different ethnic groups?
That is a really great question. And unfortunately, it's not something we specifically looked at in our study to test if there were differences in the associations we saw by ethnicity. But I think it's something that's really important that we're looking at, especially if we're thinking about just marginalized groups as well in particular. Especially in the bullying context, because we know that youth who are marginalized or bullying is often perpetrated against people who are perceived to be different. So there might be of a different culture group than the majority of people at a school, for example, or they might be of a different sexual orientation or different gender identity, or something about them is different. And that's kind of where a lot of the bullying, I guess, preys on. So I think understanding also not the effects of just bullying in general and how does bullying affect, I guess, anyone or everyone, but really how is it experienced by people who come from these marginalized groups, to see, is there maybe something specific going on that is particularly harmful for them, especially viewing that in a broader context, like something with ACEs, I think would be really interesting, but unfortunately not something we specifically looked at. So I can't give you an answer to the question other than to say that I think it's a really important question to ask and to look into.
The other theme that a number of people have raised is the important issue of the link between experiences of bullying and victimization and actually becoming the bully, the notion of the cycle that you described earlier. And I would wonder if you'd like to comment on the issue of the origin of bullying itself, the experience you've described, but the origin of the externalizing behavior that is bullying and how this relates to the theme you've been speaking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think that's a really great question, and interesting, also something that I think research is looking at more and more, especially as we're now looking into online forms of bullying. With traditional forms of bullying, there was always this power imbalance where usually the perpetrator was maybe stronger than the victim. So it was difficult for the victim to then bully others, or they had some kind of, I guess, like social imbalance over it. So it wasn't as common traditionally to have people who were both victims and perpetrators of bullying. But we're seeing it more and more in the online context, where this power imbalance is really, it's not as relevant a concept, or it can quickly change if, for example, someone can be anonymous and then you don't know who that person is. It's also much easier to react. So if someone is being bullied and they're experiencing all these negative emotions and maybe or having trouble coping with the experience, it's much easier for them to then, I guess, act on that impulsively, maybe, or have an outlet for that in terms of externalizing it to then perpetrate bullying against others. That is a bit harder if someone is in a face-to-face context. So yeah, I also yeah, I do wonder as well. I thought it was interesting we didn't see any differences in internalizing and externalizing problems. In our study, it was very, very similar, but I wonder if, obviously, when we're thinking about the bully victims, as they're often referred to, we're really thinking about the kids who are struggling with externalizing behaviors. So I think that might be something to look into a bit further. We were a bit limited in our study at looking at perpetration. The questions for it weren't as good. We didn't have as many questions on it, and it's a difficult concept to capture with self-report as well, because well, children sometimes may not report that they bully other people. It's not something someone might want to disclose about themselves, or that someone is overly aware of that or remember. We often talk about kind of memory bias in self-report, and there is something to be said that it's probably more salient to report on a victimization experience than it is on a perpetration one.
Yes, thank you. It's obviously a very interesting and important issue, and I think the point you make about the way in which the net can, in a sense, change the power balance, and therefore the individual who may feel a tremendous sense of grievance as a result of bullying can, in a sense, turn the tables in a way that perhaps would be much less possible face to face. Other interesting points that have come up. I think there was one particularly from the research perspective, which I think from Natalie Lamb, who asks, could you provide more details about how you can distinguish cumulative effects and multiplicative effects to conclude that the effects are not multiplicative, how the graphs are produced. In other words, could you say something, because this is a really key issue, isn't it, of whether factors are working independently or whether one is reinforcing and triggering the other, because there's certainly some research on the relationship between certain activities, which in fact increase senses of trauma or increased senses of stress and anxiety, so that that's very much multiplicative. But could you say something more how you managed to distinguish between these two different processes, because that's an important issue, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great question. So I guess from a very from how we tested this, to answer your question. So I think we first looked at it as in, if we think about our statistical model and we put in entered both ACEs and bullying and kind of looked, okay, if we combine these things together as trying to explain mental health outcomes, do they both contribute to the model, as in independently? So if we account for one, does adding the other do anything? And there we saw these, and that's when what we think of as cumulative effects. We said adding both was explained more than if we just had one, and adding one over the other also explains some extra information. So we could see that they're both in their own right adding to mental health problems. So that was the first step. But then, as I said, we wanted to test whether they interact with one another. And there we're really testing, okay, if in addition to that, we kind of multiply the effect of these two individual effects, is that significant? Which it wasn't. And I showed you the graphs, and I think that there you can really often sometimes see these multiplicative effects really well, because if you're thinking about cumulative effects, it would look a lot like what I showed you, where we have two parallel lines where it says the effects for someone in the bullying group is the same as someone in the non-bullying group. They both move up and down the graph the same way. Whereas if we had kind of an interactive effect, we might see that in a no bullying group, they have kind of the slope would be different. So you might see one line moving a bit lower, whereas the other one is a bit steeper. And then we could say, okay, there's clearly a difference between these two groups and how the relationship between ACEs and outcomes is. So really thinking about, is the slope between these two groups different? I hope that explained it. I know it's a really complex concept to understand.
Well, thank you for having a go. It's a beginning to be much clearer. I think an interesting point made by Stefan Davis, who says that he's been intermittently involved with the implementation of the circle of friends to help victims, and wonders if there's any research regarding this in relation to ACEs, and some further questions about the circle, about the circle of friends. In other words, therapeutic approaches and vulnerability. I mean, in a sense, what I found myself very much thinking about is what are the signals, what are the responses that children and young people who've been exposed to the multiplicity of adversity. And I agree with your idea that we need to think about adversity in a much more holistic way. What is it that the children or young people convey that somehow or other marks them out as quote, as potential victims again? And what are those very those key elements that create this process that's so powerful and harmful?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. I'm not aware of anything research-wise on this. I'm not sure if you are on. But yes, and I think it's a good question, and I think this leads back to some of the problems with when we have these, I guess, silos where we think about bullying as one issue, and we think about adverse childhood experience as a different issue, and then we develop interventions maybe for one, and we develop interventions for another, but we don't really think about them together or as co-occurring. It's like, okay, what do we do with a young person if they have both? Is there something that we could do to help them that would address their unique situation, rather than saying, okay, so ACEs, here's a list of interventions we could pick from, and okay, bullying, here's a list of things we could look at, but really thinking about that a little bit more. Yeah, I don't have a good answer on it though.
No, well, it's a very interesting and important issue about the signals, the interactive signals. Interesting. Again, Fiona Swan makes a point here that neurodiversity adds another layer to the issue of ACEs and bullying. Anxiety and their reactions impact on how they're affected. And I think that the whole issue of neurodiversity and individuals who make, there's, as you commented, there's a good deal of vulnerability in these young people who very much describe high levels of bullying and victimization so frequently. And presumably there is something about the failure to interact in a way which manages situations and which make people vulnerable through a particular response that as it were triggers a sense of anger and so on. And I think there's growing information about the way in which abusive and neglectful experiences can result in a sense of grievance and anger, and those less so. So I think that the nature of the individuals and their interaction must play a role here.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is a great point to make. And I think neurodiversity in particular is of real importance when we're looking, especially bullying experiences. So I kind of touched on this already, but how bullying kind of preys on differences, I guess. So we know that children who are neurodiverse are more likely to become victims of bullying, and maybe because they interact differently than neurotypical peers. And so they're more likely to experience these things, but also they experience bullying differently than other peers. So I think it's both of these things that we need to keep in mind. They're both more vulnerable to experience bullying in the first place, but then also the effect and how that is processed is a little bit different and needs to be just acknowledged or catered for when we're dealing with these youths.
Yes, thank you. I think that's correct. And comments from other participants that abuse and neglect and bullying all happen in schools, and sadly by adults in schools. And those of our colleagues here who heard about the verbal abuse within schools certainly will attest to that. And colleagues are really describing the important role of supportive work, and the circle of friends, presumably really to provide a social context for individuals, which will counter, as it were, the sense of adversity, victimization. One interesting point came up was whether there's more a tendency for more internalizing responses to be more prevalent than externalizing in this particular group. I'm not sure what the balance was in the research and from your experience.
That's really a really good question. So both from our research and as far as I'm aware from the research that exists, it's really both that are at heightened risk. So there doesn't seem to be particular going either way, that it's more internalizing or more externalizing. But instead, I think what it's pointing at is we probably also have really different trajectories. So that, and we need to explore individual differences here. So there'll be some kids that experience bullying ACEs and they will develop more along the externalizing problem path. And then you'll have other kids that experience this, maybe the same thing essentially, but they'll go more towards an internalizing trajectory, or maybe a mix between these symptoms. And I think this is where we also need a lot more understanding of what it is, and that what is it maybe about the experience, what is it about the person, all of those things to kind of understand, okay, what's the most likely outcome for this person and how can we best support them? Because I think it's one thing to say, oh, we know there's going to be poor mental health outcomes, but I think it would be even better if we could say, okay, we have this young person, we know this is what their experience has been like. We know that probably they're most likely to experience problems with externalizing, for example, and we can give them specific resources and we can help them specifically with those kind of issues, rather than just saying, okay, maybe we can do something for their mental health in general. I think both are important, but again, understanding more about what it is that really leads a person to go down one path or another. And we can see that in terms of severity as well, especially with both bullying and ACEs, whilst there is a kind of a cumulative effect in terms of dose, we also know that it doesn't explain everything. So someone could experience very little, I guess, and have very poor outcomes. And some other person can experience much more of these, or to a greater extent, and their mental health is relatively okay. So again, we need to understand more about what is it that then happens to kind of link these two things, and what explains the variability in outcomes to really provide better support that is better tailored. And also, we're not just using I guess severity or frequency as our only indicator of what is considered risky.
Yes, thank you. That's very interesting. Of course, there's quite a bit of research coming through at the moment, which is looking at the spectrum of threat or deprivation. In other words, is there a balance of threat in the adversity which children and young people have been exposed to? Are they exposed to violence in the home? Have they had physical or emotional abuse, verbal abuse? In other words, powerful negative experiences? Or is there a sense of deprivation, of loss, that there's a failure of responsiveness and a failure to nurture and failure to care, more on the neglect spectrum? And I think it's interesting now to see the research that's coming through that indicates that particular, as it were, particular atmospheres of threat or deprivation in the lives, children or young people, do have a differential effect. And I think that's beginning to be one important dimension to look at, isn't it? I think, and may be very relevant here.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for bringing it up. I do think it's a really important framework that to explore in relationship to adversity, and I think it can really help us make sense of a lot of the experience and how we can understand them more broadly. And I'm really interested to see how bullying fits into this framework, because I can see it being on both ends of the spectrum, where it's both a threat, as in someone who's being bullied experiences a threat to their maybe their own well-being, their being yeah, it can be really a really threatening experience, especially if we're looking at the different types of forms of bullying. So it can really be more aligned with those kind of experiences. But in the same way, because it is in this social context, I also think about it as a form of deprivation. If someone's being bullied, they might be deprived of important social connections that they would have, or they're being excluded from certain opportunities, which then deprive them of, even whether it's with peers, or they might not engage in after school activities, or they might engage less at school. So it is kind of, kind of touches on both of those concepts at the same time, of being both threatening and depriving to the individual. And yeah, so how this framework can be applied to bullying, I think, would be really interesting to further explore.
Yes, and of course, we're learning so much more about genetic influences on responsiveness. And I think the paper which we have in our newsletter from Andrea Danesi about the perception of experiences, and their research demonstrated in longitudinal study that individuals with actual objective experiences recorded in their notes and in their history of abuse and neglect, that if those experiences were not perceived in that way as abuse and neglect, they did not have the same subjective impact. And it's the subjective response that really is the core of what is associated with harmful mental health impacts. And I assume that this is going to be an important factor here. How do individuals experience the bullying? How do they experience adversity? How do they perceive it? How do they see it? How do they and that has such an important element on their on the longer term impacts, doesn't it? Interesting question. One of our participants, Ebru, says that his son has been emotionally abused from his teacher, and his son has had enough, told the parent, talked to the school, the class was changed, but he doesn't know what happened to the teacher, really. And I think the whole issue of bullying policies within schools and what influence that has, and it's certainly an important issue in terms of the recognition of bullying as a major issue that's got to be taken on board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in particular, it really goes both ways. We know that with anti-bullying policies, we know that if schools in particular have strong anti-bullying policies that are consistently enforced, that both reduces the incidence of bullying in the first place, but also for kids who are being bullied, their outcomes are better compared to schools where they don't have these policies, potentially because they feel taken seriously, they know how to act upon these. And one thing that's often really important for victims of bullying is being able to do something productive about the experience and being able to dissociate the experience from oneself. But you say, this happened to me and I can follow these steps and these are productive and these will help me cope, rather than I have experienced this and now I feel helpless and lost and no one is responding to this, which can then kind of avalanche into more mental health problems. So it's really important to not only stop bullying happening in the first place, but also help the people who are being bullied. So yes, strong policies that are consistently enforced at schools are win-win.
Yes, I think it's right. In a sense, what you're saying is that the importance of promoting resilience within school contexts, which really mean to try to ensure that experiences which are toxic stress is transformed to ordinary stressful experiences which can be managed and can be coped with and one can learn from rather than be overwhelmed by. And indeed, Natalie Lamb has asked us for comments or thoughts about the effectiveness of statutory requirements in terms of schools' behaviour policy or other macro level public health interventions and policies, and wonders about that. And of course, we all note with interest that Wales has introduced a really powerful policy in terms of developing trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed policy at all levels. And I think that this is very much an issue in terms of its effectiveness. But I'm not sure if you've got a comment about how effective such policies can be.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. I don't know if we have really good evidence at a really high policy level of how effective these are, just because they tend to be very difficult to assess and really examine. But I definitely think so. We know from a school level approach that having really good and clear policies has positive outcomes on students. And we also know that raising awareness and actually labeling things and providing context also helps a lot. So actually saying, this is what bullying is and this is not okay, we don't accept this type of behavior, that already makes a big difference for individuals, again, both in preventing the behavior and also to help victims of it deal with it, where, like you said, we can turn something that could be a toxic stress into a stressor that it wasn't pleasant, but we can do something about it. We can stop the experience. It doesn't happen again. We have helpful tools to help us cope, and then it doesn't have to become this thing that has a big impact on our lives. So I think these things can have big impacts, and especially we know this from other areas. Once we start, yeah, I guess talking about these things or acknowledging things and saying, and what isn't acceptable behavior. So for example, we're seeing this more recently in terms of weight discrimination. There's been some legislation in the US coming in saying it's now discriminatory to discriminate against someone based on their weight, which wasn't, I guess, a protective characteristic before. And now we can say, it's like, and we can slowly see when these things come into place, that we can say maybe a behavior was previously considered normative or socially acceptable, just by putting these steps into place to say this is not okay, this is not how we treat people. They can become, I guess, prevented, but also for the people who are experiencing them, it gives them a tool to deal with it.
And how to help schools. And I think you've given some very interesting definitions about different forms, direct and indirect forms of bullying. And of course, we've all been very much aware of the issues around the death of Brianna Gay and the killing, and the whole issue of how the net can, as it were, give models of bullying and models of harmful behavior, which can have such dire and terrible effects.
Yeah, and I think it is a real challenge for schools, and then I know that it is something that schools have been thinking about working with for a long time. When we think about bullying, it does change in context, like we talked about. I think there are probably a lot of different ways that schools can go about dealing with bullying. Like I talked about, having anti-bullying policies that are clear and consistently enforced, but also clear ways of finding support for people who are experiencing bullying, that they know what to do. So they know who to talk to, they know where they can find support, and that they're actually supported and believed when they report such instances. I also think I find this sometimes comes up when people say, oh, schools, they don't want to get involved in bullying, or say there is no bullying problem at the school. I think it's almost impossible for schools to know that there is no bullying going on, or it's not a problem. And so I think, be great for everyone to provide these kind of support systems. It's not to say if bullying happens, it's not necessarily the fault of the school just because it happened. That it may or it may not, but to acknowledge that there's a role they can play in both preventing instances and also helping people when it happens. And obviously it becomes more difficult if we're thinking about cyberbullying, and there's not a lot of people that want to get involved in that space. Understandably, it is very messy and complicated, but I think we need to at least give young people the tools and avenues to say, this is what might be happening, this is what you can do if this is happening, and this is who you can talk to. And being a supportive adult can make a really big difference.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, one comment from Lavinia Dowling, who says, if bullying is being dealt with better, improved support, does the bully not usually resort to being more covert? I also find it very concerning when schools insist they don't have bullying in their premises, even more so now than ever, when there's a risk of mental health issues being dismissed in schools. So I think that, of course, there will be enormous variation in terms of responses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so from a research perspective, generally if there I guess real systems in place and real kind of prevention work being done at a school, they do lead to lower rates of bullying that don't just become more covert, but actually reduce bullying. A lot of it as well is it's often a group phenomenon, whereby bullying is somewhat supported by others or encouraged by peers. So even just being able to change the culture in which it can make it less likely for some kids to engage in bullying if they were previously doing it, also to become more popular or to kind of hold on to that position of power. But I guess if the social context changes, then their behavior might also change. What I can see as being less helpful if it's more of a superficial prevention of bullying, to say we don't kind of, if someone calls each other names, then they're really strict kind of punishment for it, but it doesn't deal with the actual problem. And then kids will find other ways. They will just text each other, for example, instead of saying it in front of the teacher. So yes, I can see that being a problem, but I think the solution is here to have meaningful prevention work.
Yes, yes, and other comments have introduced some interesting points. I think Stefan Davis mentions the development of interventions such as youth mental health first aid and peer mediation, which is a useful approach. And also Sharon Gray mentions the Thrive approach to support developmentally around powering over an adults in educational settings unconsciously using unhelpful approaches. So the bystander intervention is important. Workplaces, a colleague mentions, Christine Price, inadvertently depriving staff of connections and opportunities. So I think that this raises the whole issues within workplace, within different contexts, within schools, prevention, and a culture to really to really stand up to bullying. I think so. Interesting reflections from our participants about this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'd just like to say I really like those points being raised there as well about things like bystander interventions and helping people cope. And like I said as well, if this is a social phenomena as well, we can do a lot by strengthening the peer support system as well, and changing the social context in which peers engage with one another. And often as well with bullying, we also see that bystanders are also affected by it. Even if they're not the ones being bullied, even witnessing bullying, and it can be quite distressing for young people. So it can also be really helpful for them to know what they can do if they see this, and can help their own mental health, and whilst also helping their peers. The feeling of being helpless in these kind of contexts can be also very distressing for young people. So I think it's all around really good to have those kind of support systems.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think it's been a very interesting seminar. And thank you all participants for the points that you've raised, because I think bullying is such a core experience for young people, and I think that if we think about the presentation, the last seminar about verbal abuse, and it links to bullying, the range of bullying behavior that you described at the beginning and its incidents. And I think it's very striking how many children report both experiences of bullying and persistent and intensive bullying, and to understand that we have to ask the question, what else has happened to you, as well as this particular incident of bullying, which is so distressing. And I think that what's the idea that come through is that these are individuals who often have quite an extensive vulnerability, and therefore it's very important to understand and to support and to get the appropriate help in terms of developing resilience in terms of managing experiences. So I think that we'll stop at this point. I think we've have managed to deal with most of the questions and points that have been raised. Thank you, everybody, for raising them. And thank you, Nora. And just to remind everyone that the slides and your presentation will be on the ACAMH web shortly in the next few days, and that you'll be able to really think about these very interesting results we've heard about, and to remind everyone that we're looking next month. Heather Tausig from Denver is going to be talking about peer support, in a sense, for children and young people who are in who've been fostered. So I think the theme continues. So thank you very much, and thank you for participating, and thank you, Nora, for an interesting presentation and for your results, which really bring together some important themes. So thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the great questions and comments.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Find out more about becoming an ACAMH member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.